Hi everyone, can you hear me? Thank you so much for coming here today to talk about what I believe is the most important issue in journalism, which is the political acts of violence against journalists, politically motivated acts that limit freedom of expression, that limit the ability for journalists to do their jobs. My name's Nishant Lalwani, and I'm the independent media director at Luminate, which is part of the Omidyar Group. The Omidyar Group is a philanthropic organization that funds the improvement of society around the world, and our team at Luminate focuses specifically on democracy, governance, and media. So, over the last couple of years, there's been a really worrying increase in the attacks upon journalists, in legal attacks, online attacks, and even physical attacks. Last year was CPJ's, the Committee to Protect Journalists' worst year on record, and you already, I believe, know about the severity of the situation. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. But what I want to do today is not talk about the severity of the situation, because that would be incredibly depressing. I'd like to talk about what we can do about it. And in order to facilitate that conversation, I've invited three of the people who I find most inspiring and determined and courageous when it comes to the work on press freedom in different parts of the world. And those people are Maria Ressa of Rappler, great timing, Maria, Lucy Freeman of the Media Legal Defense Initiative, and Laurent of Forbidden Stories. They're really an extraordinary set of leaders, individuals, and activists in the work that they do. And really today I want to learn more about, I want us together to learn more about what they do, and also the things that could work in this space. I truly feel that given the severity of the situation, our responses as a community are not adequate. We are good at monitoring violations, we're good at raising the profile of certain cases, but that's often reactive, it's often insufficient, and it often doesn't result in those journalists, the attacks on those journalists being dismissed. So I really want ideas from the panel, but also from the audience, around how we can better respond to the challenges we face around media freedom. So the three panelists I have here are the heads of their respective organizations, Rappler, MLDI, and Forbidden Stories, and so I'm going to let them introduce their work. And I'll start with you, Maria.
I'm sorry, I ran in.
No problem.
Ran in a little bit late. What are we doing to deal with it? I think 3 points: name it, collaborate, and spread it. So, you know, what is happening? I think this is unprecedented. We should call it out. There's definitely impunity. You've heard me talk about the online stuff, but this is only the fertilizer, the astroturf, and then power comes in and repeats that same message. Collaborate. You can't do this alone. We're learning that. In the Philippines, the news groups are coming together. In the United States, in January this year, they were CPJ, a bunch of other organizations are trying to get journalists to come together. The people defending the facts are not coming together, and the ones who are tearing down facts are very coordinated. And then finally, we got to tell the people they're being manipulated. That's what we're trying to do in Rappler.
Thank you, Maria. Lucy, do you want to tell us a bit about MLDI and your approach?
Media Legal Defense Initiative is set up to try and meet the legal threats and the legal attacks that happen to journalists. So recognizing that it's quite a common way to attempt to silence an independent media, and it ties up journalists in lengthy cases that are incredibly expensive and can really mean the end of the ability to publish. Media Legal Defense Initiative helps pay for local lawyers, will help fund the legal case. We have some in-house lawyers that will also help those lawyers with comparative law from around the world and make the case as strong as it can be. We are more proactive in the litigation that we do as well. So if there's a problematic piece of legislation that's introduced or a practice that's particularly problematic, we will go to court to try and challenge it to get a wider impact for a bigger group of journalists. And we also fund organizations at the national level to do the same thing. So instead of us directly supporting cases, we will fund national organizations to develop in-country media defense capacity. And then to support those three areas, we also work with lawyers on the ground to help them develop their media law resources. So we have about 200, 250 cases ongoing at any one time in about 50 countries around the world. So it's a big problem, and we're really a drop in the ocean in terms of the severity of the legal challenges that are facing journalists at the moment. But also we have a pretty good success rate, so it's about a 70% success rate in the cases that we do. So with a little bit of support and with the ability to fight those legal challenges, they can actually be beaten.
Thank you. Laurent.
Yes, hello. So my name is Laurent Ressa, and I'm running Forbidden Stories. Forbidden Stories is an investigative network devoted to continue the work of journalists who have been threatened, jailed, or killed. We consider that when a journalist is threatened or jailed, killed, it's because he's working on a very important topic, whether it's about money laundering, environmental crimes. And so we do have to continue the work and make sure that people get access to critical information. And maybe I can show you a very short video that explains what we did so far.
Daphne Caruana Galizia
killed when a bomb exploded.
Connected to the aggressive work she had done calling out corruption in Malta.
Forbidden Stories was created as a platform to protect stories of silenced journalists. Threatened journalists can back up their sensitive information through one of our encrypted channels. Their stories will be held securely in case something happens. Forbidden Stories will be able to access the stories, complete them thanks to its partners, and reveal it broadly. The first Forbidden Story was about Daphne. We coordinated the work of 45 journalists to review a massive number of files in a complete secrecy and complete Daphne's investigations with one common objective: revealing what her killers wanted to hide. 6 months after her death, we hit the news.
An international consortium of journalists is scrutinizing Malta as part of the so-called Daphne Project.
In one day, and for weeks, Daphne's stories made the headlines all over the world.
Forbidden Stories, an international network of journalists
designed to finish these stories and the investigations that we're working on.
In a week, hundreds of millions of people have been potentially exposed to Daphne's stories, dramatically increasing the number of readers of her blog. This is how a local investigation became an international affair.
The European Commission will pursue this. We will keep pushing the Maltese authorities. We will keep pushing them. No stone should remain unturned.
Today, we gave Daphne a new voice, and as long as journalists will be threatened, jailed, or killed, we will keep stories alive.
Yeah, this is it.
Thank you, Laurent. Thanks to our panelists for the introductions. I'm going to use my privilege as chair to ask them a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So do start thinking about what you want to ask them. So Maria, you care about press freedom. I care about press freedom. So does everyone in this room. But it's us, right? We're at the International Journalism Festival. Of course people here care. If you look at the Edelman Trust Barometer, only 47% of people in the country surveyed trust the media. So how can we ask 53% of people to defend something that they don't even trust? How do we break through the echo chamber and actually broaden the movement for press freedom?
So I think one of the things that makes the Philippines different is that because our institutions have long been weak and corrupt, endemic corruption, right? Journalists had played this role. In Tagalog, it's called sumbungan ng bayan. Our sumbungan ng bayan means where you go to ask for help. And up until 2016, journalists and news organizations actually had very high credibility ratings, larger than government, larger than the church at certain points. I think part of the problem is that in 2016, the weaponization of social media began, and you can see how quickly it not only attacked traditional media, but how quickly it changed values and splintered society. 6 months, that's all it took, from making Filipinos who were, Philippines was one of the first signatories to the Declaration of Human Rights, to all of a sudden saying, it's okay to kill. Why shouldn't we kill? Otherwise, you'll be the one killed, or your daughter will be raped, right? These are some of the things. So how do you do this? Build communities of action. This was in the Philippines, the Philippine Trust Index, which is a partner of the Edelman Trust Survey. Mm-hmm. They came out with a survey of only people on social media. 83% said they distrusted traditional media, 83% of people on social media. But that same month, if you saw the speech I gave yesterday, that same month, the Pew Global Attitude Survey said 86% of Filipinos trust traditional media. So you are right now seeing a splintering, a remaking of reality and the role of journalists in society. So what we're doing is going back, pulling our communities together. We meet. Rappler has a civic engagement arm called Move PH. We do 2 to 3 times a week. We do outreach programs. It is both on the ground and on virtual. And then the second thing that we're trying to do is to get the social media platforms to clean up the toxic sludge that is actually that's killing democracy. So once we have that, then we hope to be able to go back and get the communities back. Again, if you don't know whom to trust, if you don't know that this is a bottle of water because someone else is telling you this is an apple, then how can you even begin to have a discussion, right? So we go back to that. Let's try to put the facts back in so that we can bring trust back.
Thank you, Maria. Can you talk to me a bit more about what communities of action look like? We know what communities looked like in the past because we lived through it. With Move.ph, what's the end goal, and how will that stop Duterte pressurizing you?
So Rappler is 7 years old. Sorry, I didn't really do the introduction for you of what we are. I'm a traditional I'm a traditional broadcast journalist, right? And I've been a journalist for more than 30 years. But in 2012, we decided to launch Rappler. And the idea of Rappler was not investigative journalism alone. It was actually the elevator pitches, and I did the elevator pitch to Omidyar Network before Luminate. But I did the elevator pitch. It is, we build communities of action. Because I've been tired of throwing... As a bureau chief for CNN, as a correspondent for CNN, I hated throwing stories into a black box. And what I wanted was to have real impact in our society. So what are communities of action? We experimented. The very beginning of Rappler was actually our civic engagement arm, right? And that civic engagement arm tried to look at what does our society need? And a good thing was to look at the Sustainable Development Goals. That was kind of our, behind the scenes, what was driving us, and it drives our editorial agenda. But here's what we first found. In a country like the Philippines, where you have an average of 20 typhoons every year, people need help in disasters. People need help with climate change. So climate change became our first community of action. And what we did as journalists is We created a portal and a platform where we worked with government. This is the civic engagement arm. We worked with government during disasters. We created a system with them because information is power. And then we wound up doing hashtags that helped rescue people. That was incredible. And during disasters, you have no political color. There's nothing to debate about. Everyone is working together. And we found that extremely empowering. That's since evolved from looking at disaster and climate change. Now, the biggest thing that our communities want, how do you tell fact from fiction, disinformation?
Okay, thank you so much. Lucy, there's been a rise of autocratic leaders, unfortunately, in many countries around the world. And a part of the autocrat's playbook, I'm thinking of Trump and Duterte and Bolsonaro and others, is to distort the judiciary and use it against journalists, rather than the way in which you try and use it to defend them. So how do we counter that? What can we do about that?
You're absolutely right. And it's been... you're absolutely right. And so while it's always been a tool of the powerful to try and use the law and the expense of the law against journalists and against critical voices, you do see a rise in that under the leaders that we have at the moment in various countries around the world. And an additional challenge to that is, at the same time that the media is under attack, at the same time you have this one very strong pillar of accountability. At the same time and hand in hand, that often goes with an attack on the judiciary and the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law and the Constitution. And so while you would hope to be able to look to that for some kind of protection, often it's also under attack. So you get this kind of double crisis. And what we're seeing at the moment, in addition to this new pressure coming from the leaders that we have, there is an added pressure that through perhaps some hastily crafted legislation trying to deal with issues of misinformation, trying to deal with some of the very serious issues that we're seeing, as we've heard described, about the use of social media to attack institutions, to attack individuals. We're seeing new laws being passed that actually have completely the opposite effect, and even kind of problematic but well-meaning laws in one country are then copied, and additional criminal penalties are added in other countries. So we're having a rise of false news laws, cybercrimes legislation, various types of attempts to control the online space, which of course are used against journalists. I think Thailand was one of the first countries in 2007, I think, to pass Computer Crimes Act. They've since updated it and several times and made it much worse. But of course it was a journalist that was one of the first people to be prosecuted under that. So we've seen it already and it's carrying on. So we're kind of fighting it at all sides. But that said, there is still a great benefit to going to court to fight the case. So do it. There are huge pressures on the courts. There are pressures on the international courts as well for different reasons. But the outcome that you will get by having a good legal team to fight the case, even if you end up with some kind of conviction, is going to be much better than if you don't have that at all, either because you just won't fight the case and will not publish the work, or because you'll have a much higher sentence. So that's one aspect. It's just to carry on, even if the justice system is weakened, continue to use it, continue to get the limited defense that you can. Engaging international courts and the regional mechanisms when you can. Particularly we're in Europe at the moment, and it can be a long time to get to the European Court, but they still, in most circumstances, can deliver very strong judgments on freedom of the press and the protection of journalists. So it's really worth, even if it takes a number of years, continuing to pursue the case to get it there. And when that fails, when the judiciary really is not independent enough to be able to provide any kind of protection, it's the long game. So in the Gambia, for example, they had a whole litany of cases against them from international courts. And then eventually there is regime change, and all of those things those judgments are there, and justice for the families of the victims, of the exiled journalists, can start to be realized and implemented. So it's a much longer game, but it's still one worth pursuing. The other thing is being quite proactive in terms of these new laws that are coming in, challenging them ideally before they get passed, but even when they are passed, trying to go to court to highlight the ways that they are either unconstitutional, the ways that they're going to compromise press freedom, and trying to stop them that way.
Thanks, Lucy. So, Maria, Lucy said that even if you have cases against you, it's worth fighting them. You have 11 cases against you right now, been arrested 4 times. Is she right?
Absolutely. And thank you, Lucy. Absolutely. Not that I have any choice, but I think, what Lucy said is, in the end, even if it is a verdict that goes against you, the fact that you fight it has an impact on your community, 1. 2, you can hold those people to account, because I don't think these things occur in isolation, right? We will look back on this, and we can hold these names. I mean, you will hear me start to talk about our judges. Sorry, not to pressure them or anything, but we don't have, let me rephrase this. The test is now for our judiciary. There have been a lot of very difficult decisions that have been made, but I'm hoping, and I have to hope, that the pressure of scrutiny, when you shine the light, individual men and women are going to be making decisions. They will own those decisions. And what we're seeing is that, what I'm hoping is that pressure from government will be offset by these individual battles for integrity. It has to be. So yes, absolutely, Nishant, we will fight them.
Thank you. Laurent, as Lucy pointed out, the situations, the contexts in different countries are extremely different when it comes to freedom of expression, when it comes to the ways in which journalists are persecuted. And yet, Forbidden Stories, in both of its major projects so far, has worked very internationally. The Daphne project was centered in Malta, but spanned multiple countries in terms of the journalists who published. Your Ecuadorian, Colombian, the Deadly Border Project was similar. Why is it that you collaborate so much, and how do you then have impact in specific countries by doing so?
Well, I think that one key thing regarding the threat against journalists is a collaboration. When we did the Daphne project, we were working with 45 reporters from 18 news organizations, and we were doing that not only to investigate the killing of Daphne, but also to continue the work of Daphne, because the work of Daphne was also not only important for the Maltese public opinion, but for all the European people, because Daphne was working on money laundering, which involve a Dubai-based company, UK-based company, and so the crimes are crossing borders, so we need to cross border when we are investigating the crimes. And so that's what we did with the Daphne project, and we also think that if they want to hide something in La Valette in Malta or in Baku in Azerbaijan, we can make sure that we can expose the very same crime in London, in Nairobi, in the Philippines, and I think by this way we can send a powerful signal to enemies of the free press that if they want to kill a messenger, they will never kill the message, and we can amplify why they wanted to hide at the beginning. So I think really that even on the legal aspect, it's much more difficult for a corporation, for some individuals or some state to sue one journalist if you have 56 other journalists who publish the very same information. It will be not very smart to start a defamation case if you have a huge collaboration like this in front of you. So I really think that we need also to convince ourselves in our newsroom that when a journalist is killed in Mexico because he's investigating the Sinaloa cartel, for instance, it's not only a Mexican story, that's also a French story or a UK story, because the Sinaloa cartel is selling drugs in more than 56 countries in the world. So that's something we need to really to think and to work, I think, this way, and to make those crimes very global, because the threat is global, so the answer need to be global if we really want to defend press freedom and use journalism to defend journalism, basically.
Thanks. I'm just going to ask you one more question, but this is my last question, so I expect some from the audience shortly. do you find that working across borders, across organizations, on these sensitive matters, how does that require sort of behavioral change amongst journalists?
A lot of change. I think that thanks to work from ICAJ, OCCRP, fantastic organization like this, who really, they were the first doing cross-border project, very complex, very sensitive on tax avoidance and many other financial crimes or other issues. We are now, I think, seeing a new generation of journalists ready to collaborate and to share the information. Sharing a story is not normal for journalists. We become journalists to be a bit protective and we want our scoop, we want to make a difference, but we need, I think now, thanks to the Panama Papers and all the kind of collaboration, we understood that by sharing, we can have a much more precise information, much more impact, and so, and I think that's why we decided to become journalists to make the society better. So I think collaboration is changing a lot the landscape of journalism right now.
Thanks, Laurent. So I'm going to hand it over to questions from the audience. Do we have mics? Yes, we do. Please keep your questions as questions and also short. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Jakub Paruszyński from the Media Development Foundation. Thank you for making a panel that could be very dark, actually quite reassuring, and I really like the call to fight. Oppressing journalists and media in general nonetheless comes very cheap for authoritarian governments, right? It's easy to pass a law, it's easy to attack individual journalists. We had a particularly egregious case with Khashoggi where, you know, after such a devastating case, nonetheless, hundreds of businesses came for Davos in the desert and, well, maybe sent replacements instead of the key figureheads. My question is this: how can we raise the price for oppressing media?
Laurent, do you want to take that one?
Well, I think it's a bit what I said already. I think to raise that price, I think we need to think about what the enemies of the free press have in mind, and the problem for them is to hide the crimes, whether it's financial crimes or other kind of crimes. So if we think this way and decided to expose the crimes and protect the stories, then probably that will be it will dissuade them, and they will think twice about killing a journalist or threatening a journalist or harassing a journalist. So that's I think that if we protect the story, we can protect the information. That's my take.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we also need to look, other than just raising the price for autocrats, at lowering the cost of dissent for journalists, for individuals, for lawyers, for activists. And we at Luminate try and support work that around community organizing, around civic empowerment, around communities for action, and people, once they bandy together, even if it isn't physically. For example, in Turkey, physical protests are shut down very often, but behind the scenes and online, there are significant groups, individual activists who are building momentum, and they're very powerful and much harder to shut down than the traditional civic space. Any other questions? Yep.
Hello. I'm Alicia, and also a freelance journalist. I'm mainly focused on the Southeast Asia's issues. This topic is very interesting. My question is about, I found that when I'm working in Southeast Asia, fear of the state power is the biggest weapons, like constrain people to actually take actions. Even though some of you really involving in advocating these issues, but how to get citizens be involving in and taking actions, because people seem to accept being oppressed, being constrained by the state, and this is not just only in South Asia, but in the world in general. So I found this is the most difficult part, how to get all citizens, all people involving. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks so much. I think that's a great question. So I think in Southeast Asia, the first is our culture is more prone to accept authority, right? High power distance index in our culture. And it is a value to respect authority. Having said that, I'll use the Philippines as an example of our own descent from democracy to tyranny. This brutal drug war, where you have tens of thousands of people killed now, seeded violence, which created fear. And that fear is part of what pushed people to not speak. You saw it both online and in the real world. And then after that, they saw examples. The government literally took a politician. This is Laila de Lima, a senator who was former Justice Secretary, and they made her an example. She attacked the president. She was jailed for 2 years, and it was almost her second year in prison where her trial began. I, unfortunately, and Rappler, were the cautionary tale for journalists. You speak too much. You ask too many questions. This is what will happen to you. 11 cases. In 14 months. It was very fast. So what's happening? Here's what's happening. We continue to speak truth to power. And we have to lift that ceiling that is pushing down so that more people can come into this space to speak. And we're seeing that happen, and perhaps part of the reason just last weekend, I was arrested on a Friday, posted bail, another arrest warrant was issued on Monday, I posted bail again, and then I was arraigned on the first of the 11 cases on Wednesday. Thank God I'm in Perugia now. You know, that was Wednesday, began with my arraignment and ended here. The fact that we're still speaking, that we're doing stories, that while I was traveling, Rappler released 3 different investigative pieces from the Philippine Center of Investigative Journalism, looking at the wealth of the Duterte family, the fact that President Duterte overnight threatened to declare a revolutionary government as a reaction to that his son reacted to it. There's debate online, there's debate in the real world. The last story is the links of the family of President Duterte to the drug syndicates. So these are things that we continue doing. The more we keep doing it, the more our society will push back. This is, I guess the last part is, courage inspires courage. And I think it's, we couldn't certainly not have done this alone, even though I do have a big mouth and I can run off. The MLDI, thank you for the help. The international community has truly helped us in this. And you asked, how can you make it more difficult? Coming together, really, the same way you did for Daphne, right? I mean, that's part of the reason it was really important for me to come here, because this is the big change, and the change that the technology has pushed forward. Never at any other time of history have we all been pulled together. In the past, we can live in our own vertical silos of every country. But when you have a platform like Facebook, which will take they're now at 2.7 billion accounts all around the world, a lie seated in Perugia will pop up in the Philippines 3 seconds later, right? Depending on how the information flow happens. So we're connected. Whether the journalists can work as fast as the disinformation, because there's certainly geopolitical power involved here, right? There's a playbook, and it's connected to both Russia. The last point I will make is, I always say Russia is B2C. This kind of disinformation was first used on its citizens, then it went to the Ukraine. It's been replicated using hate to incite hate. And then what we're seeing in the Philippines is China as B2B. China just recently signed a deal with the Philippine government for video surveillance. And these are things that help stifle civic engagement, that help authoritarian rulers maintain more control. It's a fight for power. So we go back. If it is a fight for power and information is power, the journalists have to come together to help our societies push back.
And if I just add something, I think you start, Nishant, with a number of 53% of distrust from the public opinion to the journalist, and that's something we should do something for fixing this situation. And I think there is a lot of effort from our side in terms of education and explanation for who we are working for. I think the distrust is coming because people can think that journalists are partisan or journalists are working for industrial interests from some corporation, also for some political parties. We need to re-explain that when we are investigating tax avoidance, this is for the taxpayer, this is for the state, this is for all the money we are missing for building hospitals, schools. And so this, I think we really need to explain for who we are working for and that we are working for the general interest. But that's more, I think, an educational issue than we need to probably at school to explain what journalism is about. It's about educating and making the society better in explaining this issue. Yeah.
Lucy, can I ask you about the role of raised profile in legal cases? You know, so Maria was Time Person of the Year, case was covered in the New York Times, etc., and The Guardian. Laurent focuses on raising the profile of cases. Does that help in terms of legal judgments?
Well, formally no, because of course the judges are independent and they would never pay attention to that. But of course it does. And so it helps on a whole range of levels. So for the individual journalist to know that if you're in detention or you have this huge case against you, actually people are aware of that and they're listening and then they're following what's going on. For the judiciary, of course there's pressure if you know, and it's your professional pride, and it's just as a judicial body, if you know that there are other people, if there are other courts that are watching what you do, it creates an additional pressure to at least appear to be finding as close as you can to the right decision. So if you look at the situation in Turkey, for example, the Constitutional Court, and we've really seen a kind of almost complete collapse of the rule of law in Turkey, where you had the Constitutional Court, which was under so much pressure, of course, from Erdogan, because judges are also being arrested, and a lot of cases were waiting to be heard, and they didn't want to find in the cases because they knew how wrong their decisions were going to be if they bowed to this pressure. And in the cases where they did actually make the right decision and find in favour of the journalist that's been charged, the lower courts refused to implement the decision. So you can see that the courts also, especially the higher courts, which tend to be judges that have more experience and a bigger professional reputation, they are aware of what's going on. And then there's also the situation of the journalist. So, for example, there was a journalist in Azerbaijan, Khadija, who was doing this fantastic work on corruption, came under a huge amount of harassment and was detained, and was also fighting her case proactively, so bringing cases to the European Court to challenge her treatment in Azerbaijan. And in the course of that, although the charges against her weren't dropped at the domestic level, she was released from detention. So the countries as well, the governments, are aware of the pressure and the attention to the case that's going on. And even if they don't drop the charge completely, they might somehow reduce the severity of the conditions that the journalist is facing or reduce the charge.
Thank you. Any more questions from our audience? No? Okay, I'll ask some of... Yep, there's one from James at the back there. James, you mind raising your hand so they can bring the mic to you or standing up? Yeah.
Thanks. I'm James Dean from BBC Media Action. As well as the calling out and raising the cost of attacks on journalists and clampdowns on media freedom, do you think there might be a way of better political or other ways of rewarding political leaders who are prepared to stand up for media freedom and who are prepared to open up their societies? I think we talk a lot about the downside of this, which I think we need to do a lot more of. But could there be more incentives for doing what is actually often very politically difficult and often politically very risky if you're actually fostering an oppositional media, especially if you're losing control of your own, if information is power. If you're ceding information and you're ceding your control over information, you're ceding power. So how can we think more creatively about perhaps some more reputational reward for those who are prepared to actually take that political risk?
Who wants to take that one?
I don't know.
Okay.
Marie?
So I'm thinking of a leader like Macron, for example, who has to take great, and this one I'll speak from experience with the RSF had set up the Information and Democracy Commission, which is 25 different people from many different countries around the world to look at democracy and information, right? And we had a meeting with him where it was so clear that he believed in it, and then 5 other world leaders came together. Not surprisingly, Trudeau was one of them. Not so surprisingly, President Trump was not one of them. But then the yellow vest protests began, and you realize that every leader has to deal with their own domestic issues where perception, disinformation is used against them in different ways. So incentives, it's very hard. I think the reason the 3 of us looked at each other and said, please take this. On my end, I think it's a difficult time where this kind of information ecosystem is tainted, that not only do journalists have a hard time, leaders who are trying to do the right thing have fewer incentives to do the right thing, because this is a naked power grab. Information is being used to manipulate people for power. And if you don't do it, the question is, can I survive it? And how do I fight an enemy that doesn't fight fairly? So maybe my colleagues can think of something better, but this is, I say, no, you can't play with the same field. We need to keep our values, but this is a question of the opposition, for example, in the Philippines. And inevitably what winds up happening is they really don't have a voice.
And just to add something and to answer your question on a bit of my experience and talking about French president, I did an investigation for the French public television called My President is on Business Trip. And I was following François Hollande, the former French president, in Azerbaijan and in Kazakhstan. And the question of the documentary was about how do you behave when you are the president of the democracy, the France, and you want to import and deal some important contracts about oil and gas in Azerbaijan, which is a dictatorship, and Kazakhstan. And the question is how do you address the question of human rights? And most of the time you have those statements and the 2 questions from the press during the official visit. And the French presidency is always saying the same kind of statement, that we do respect, we do have some values in France, we are for the human rights, of course, protection, but we don't want to interfere. And but we ask our partner to do more and do better. And that's something, that kind of a statement. And so, but I think what is very useful is that when we are traveling as a journalist with our president traveling in other countries, is to keep asking the question that local journalists cannot ask, and to get some answers about human rights violation in some countries. And I did the same when the president of Azerbaijan came to France, and I was asking questions to both of the 2 presidents. And so that's a way we can act as a journalist, by following those presidents. Those presidents are traveling a lot, so we need to travel with our question with them, I think.
Yeah. Go ahead, Lucy.
I mean, from a narrower legal perspective, I think certainly when we've won these big judgments from regional courts where there's been a very significant decision about criminal defamation or some other new principle that's been set, those judges are incredibly proud of those judgments because they feel they've really set a new standard. And so for them to see them raised in other courts around the world and to have that echoed is very beneficial, and certainly litigating organizations and freedom of expression, civil society do kind of praise them for that and to use the judgments in their own publicity and statements. So on a more narrow perspective.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I think that there have been examples recently of government stepping up. For example, in the case of Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, who has been imprisoned in Iran for the last 3 years. The Foreign Office in the UK turned it into a diplomatic case. A couple of hours ago, the Foreign Office in the UK appointed Mark Clooney as the special envoy. They're making this a huge priority. And I think that should be applauded and encouraged, especially in a time when the US is not at the forefront of press freedom. Any other questions? I have one for Laurent, which is that the scale of the attacks on journalists are so large, worrying, so numerous. I mean, one journalist is killed in Mexico every month on average. How do you choose which cases to focus on? Must be a very difficult
Yeah, that's a difficult question.
Yeah.
And a difficult choice. First, we are trying to take the time to do this kind of investigation because the time is really a key issue. You need time because first we don't want to endanger more journalists we are working with locally. So we have to think about what will happen to them after the publication, something like that. So we need time for making risk assessment. We need time to investigate because it's complex, because of legal issues. We are trying also to identify cases when we first try to identify if the journalist, what was the last story was working, what was the threat he was receiving, how we can investigate, how we can collect evidence regarding the crime itself, and how we can continue the work, and how collaboration can bring some value on a journalistic point of view. But also there is also other criteria. Can we go into this country? What is the visa rules over there? Can we send a group of journalists over there? And so we are trying to assess that kind of, and to choose the investigation we can do, and we can bring some more information, and we can ask the question that local journalists cannot anymore ask. And so that's a complex decision, and we try to take really the time and not to go too fast to make sure that we can investigate and we can find new revelation, and we are doing that this year.
Thank you. If there's no more questions from the audience, there is one there. Okay, go ahead. Last question of the day.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much. A very quick comment on journalists attacking other journalists and their role on attacking both their professional profile and, in the end, their physical security. Thank you so much.
Okay. You have a question, or that was just a comment?
No. I'm asking a comment on this issue, like clashes between journalists and journalists, because journalists might become might be weaponized and attacking other journalists in smearing campaigns.
Yeah. I think critics are always very welcome, whatever your profession, and of course it's important to be able to criticize or to have objective views on some stories, on the work of others. But in that context, where you have that level of distrust, I think it's important for journalists to have some conscience about this kind of clash on social networks, and this way we can see that in Turkey sometimes, or some journalists are really harassing other journalists. So I think we really need to be very careful on this and the impact of that, and the picture we are sending to the population about ourselves. Yeah.
I mean, I'll talk about it at two levels. One is there's the captured media that will attack. And I'll talk about it from personal experience. I have former journalists who became government officials who are actively spreading disinformation and attacking both Rappler and me, and it's very effective on social media. One former journalist actually said both of my parents are Indonesians, and then tried to tear me down with that. But, both of my parents are not Indonesians, but this is how effective it is. A week later, a college friend from the United States called me up to ask me if my parents are Indonesians. So I don't know the right thing to do. What I did is on Twitter, I just took that tweet that was a lie and and corrected it, but you all know the corrections never spread as much as the lie itself. A former government spokesman, the same way, former journalists. Now, can we prevent this? No, this is captured. This is corruption. This is not, some do it for power, others do it for money. The 3 C's, corrupt, coerce, co-opt. And this is part of our world today. And I think that I'll just connect it to our discussion here, which is what power is about. I think all of this stuff, this kind of exponential hate that social media enabled, has led to this, has fed into this growing move of populism towards authoritarianism, towards dictatorship. I hope not. It's a politics of hate. And it is a politics, it's a type of politics that destroys not just the quality of democracies, but it destroys the ability to build. It destroys communities, right? So where are the people to push back, right? They're afraid right now. They don't know that there's a problem, and we journalists ourselves are not really calling it out yet. We have our old jobs to do, hold power to account, right, in the real world. But there's a lot more at stake here now. And so, sorry, not a simple answer to your question. Sorry about that.
No, but a very important one. And thank you to all of our panelists for all that they've shared with us today, and the audience for contributing their learnings too. I wrote down some of the things that I felt that I'd learned during this panel, and they're as follows. I learned that even when Maria's late, she's got her top 3 points rolling off her tongue, classic broadcast journalist. I learned that press freedom can be an insular issue, an arcane issue, but if you make a compelling documentary format video, maybe you can broaden who cares about press freedom to beyond the usual suspects. I learned that we need to build communities of action and stop putting stories into a black box. I learned that there's 20 typhoons a year in the Philippines. I didn't know that. I learned that you have to fight. You have to keep fighting. And we have people who are doing that with us today. I learned that you have to keep the long game in mind, especially in the Gambia. I learned that sharing stories doesn't come naturally, but that it's a really powerful mechanism when you do it. I learned that Russia is B2C and China is B2B. I'm going to remember that. I learned that judges don't read the news, except, of course, they do. I learned that we need to celebrate leaders who defend media freedom. And lastly, I learned that Maria's parents are Indonesian. That's right. I think that was right. Thanks so much for joining us, and see you at the rest of the conference.